They told me I didn't belong at their table, so I printed out every check, every receipt, and walked into their dining room carrying a briefcase. What happened next was the quietest and most devastating revenge I ever planned. My name is Carlos Mendoza. I'm 62, a widower. If you've ever been taken for granted by someone you love, hit like and subscribe, because this one's for anyone who's been used, then written off. Stick around. I promise this story is worth the listen. They don't teach you how to grieve in a handbook. There's no class, no manual, no checklist for how to continue when the person who anchored you to every small joy and chore is suddenly a photograph on the mantel. Ana's laugh used to live in the house. Her scent, powder, and lemon lingered in the linen closet for years after she was gone. After 40 years of building houses and roads and a life I could be proud of, she was the one who kept us steady. My hands, my plans, my temper, when the day dragged on and the crew pushed back. I learned how to keep things steady by building. Little jobs at first, a neighbor's fence, a backyard patio, and then bigger, a duplex, a small apartment block, the office next to the bakery. I wasn't flashy. I had no fancy trucks with chrome and logos that rotated in the sun. My truck was a trustworthy, dented thing that smelled like sawdust, coffee, and the leather of a too-worn seat. My crew was men who'd grown up in the same neighborhood. Miguel, Tomas, Rosa's son, guys who came when you called and left sweat and pride and the occasional curse word on the job. We paid taxes, we kept the local hardware store busy, and we fed people who trusted a man when he shook his hand. Ana used to joke that we were a boring American dream, like something you could wallpaper a guest room with, but it was ours. And then she was gone, and the walls felt like they were waiting for someone to come home. Our son Ethan was 28 then, a bright kid who liked politics and debates and could talk circles around men twice his age. He had a good heart, but his heart was warm in the ways of youth. Earnest to the point of being vulnerable. When Ethan met Olivia, I liked her at first. She had a smile that could make him forget his own worries. She wore scarves like they were armor and spoke as if she were already the star of a book I'd never read. She was charming the way some people are, always slightly better lit than the rest of us. I offered her coffee in the office one morning while she and Ethan talked renovation plans for their first little apartment, and she told me how she liked granite counters and a kitchen that felt like a home you'd photograph for a magazine. I smiled and said, "We can do that, because I'm a man who builds things." After Ana died, everything felt fragile. Ethan moved back in for a while. We ate at the kitchen table and watched late-night shows we both pretended to like. He married Olivia the following summer. I poured time into the wedding. Ana's old silver was cleaned and used. My crew moved chairs into the backyard at noon, when the sun was kindest, and I gave a short speech that made both men and women in the crowd tear up. I remember thinking, I did all right. I'd given my son a good start, but life is not a movie that arranges its plots to our convenience. The first time Olivia made that face, the one that said we were on different chapters of a book she'd already decided to edit, I chalked it up to nerves. Then the comments came slowly, like hairline cracks. A joke about our furniture looking old-fashioned. A clap about how humble my truck was. Another quiet aside about how Ethan was lucky to be stepping up by marrying into people who liked to travel. They were small things at first. You'd nod, you'd make a polite laugh, and then you'd file the words away like a receipt you think you might need later. The money started the way money often does in families, quietly. Ethan and Olivia were persistent about their vision for a house. A real home with crown molding, wide plank floors, an oven that didn't belong to the 1990s. I saw them working overtime, heard the quiet phone calls, watched Ethan show me a listing with a nervous smile and the kind of hope that looks physical. I wanted them to have that. I remember waking up in my office that winter and deciding to help with the down payment. I wrote the check from the equity in our house, $42,000. I wrote it because I believed in building for your kid and giving him the ladder that you wished someone had given you. I told myself this was love, plain as a set of plans. Then the small things became regular. An unexpected bill here, credit card payments there, a kitchen remodel when Olivia decided granite was essential, $17,200. I paid it because she called me in the middle of a Tuesday and said, "We'll do something nice for Ethan." I reminded myself that the act of giving sweetened me. It made me feel useful and needed. So I set up an automatic transfer, $2,600 a month, to help with their mortgage and bills. It was the sort of thing I did without fanfare. A line item in my ledger, an automatic exit from my account that I barely noticed between invoices and payroll and the small satisfactions of the workday. 5 years of that. 60 months, $156,000. It was a number that meant less to some men than the price of gasoline, but to me it was everything. Vacations postponed, repairs delayed, a new truck that stayed a whisper of a possibility. I'd help the neighbors, pay the men, tip the helper who did Sunday brunch at Rosa's. But the transfers went out like clockwork, my hand on a lever that assumed the future would be grateful. Money doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is a language. And because I paid, they began to speak to me in the tones of entitlement. Olivia started to tell me, politely but firmly, that the way I did things was not really their vibe. The words hit like a wind you aren't prepared for from behind, leaving you off balance. And Ethan, who had always been soft-spoken, began folding himself into what she suggested, apologizing sometimes for my old-fashioned ways in a voice that felt more like a public relations script than a son defending his father. There were signs I missed or refused to accept, invitations that arrived too late, calls that got cut off when I asked about the plan for dinner, a way their lives moved around polished social calendars where my presence seemed inconvenient. I justified it. They were young, building their own family. But gradually, after the 5th, 10th, 20th time, the pattern set its teeth. Then December arrived, and with it the cruelest cut of all. I went over one evening to drop off a piece of furniture I'd promised to refinish. The house was warm. The tree was a neat magazine-style thing with lights that blinked in coordinated beats. Someone had spent money on a wreath that was almost too perfect. It was my fingerprints everywhere, the floors I paid for, the crown molding my men had installed, the curtains we'd chosen together. But there was an invisible sign on the front door that read, "Certain company only." "Ethan," I said when I came through, "I left the coffee table as promised." He looked up from his phone. Olivia stood in the doorway to the dining room, a smile that was almost professional on her face. "Dad," Ethan said, and the tone carried the way it does when a grown man is asked to read a speech he doesn't believe in. Ethan told me, no preface, no softening, that I wouldn't be welcome at their house for Christmas. "Olivia's parents will be here," he said, staring at his hands as if the words were something living that could be nudged elsewhere. "They'd prefer if we don't have guests that are different." The word landed like a stone. For a moment the aroma of pine and roasting something in the oven was a background for the loudness of my heart in my chest. I kept my voice steady because my hands, built for work and for steadying others, were not trembling yet. "Different how?" I asked. Olivia's smile thinned. "You know," she said, "the way someone tells you a truth they've been told by others. It's not about you personally. It's just what they're used to. What they were used to was a house that cost more than my years of saving. What they were used to was a family that smelled like fresh citrus cleaners and did CrossFit on Saturdays. What they were used to was performance." I left. I should have stayed. Maybe said something in front of them, an old man standing, shaking with the gravity of loss and the sudden, cold clarity of being expelled from your child's life. But I didn't. I drove home with the heat on because my hands were numb and sat in my kitchen with a mug that steamed in a silence so heavy it felt like furniture. That night I did the same thing people do when the world tilts. I went through the motions. I unlocked the safe where I kept the bank book and receipts, the small papers that make a lifetime feel real. I pulled up the automatic transfer on my bank app and stared at the digits, $2,600. I had set it 5 years earlier because it made life easier. The little number pulsed on my screen like something alive. I canceled it. It was not loud. There was no dramatic flourish, no music swelled. I tapped the cancel button and felt the air leave my chest, as if I had taken a deep breath I'd been denying myself for years. For the first time in 5 years, a month without that withdrawal didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a small, honest breath. I sat there and let the kitchen clock tick in a voice that sounded like the house breathing. My hands were steady now. I poured myself a glass of the good whiskey Ana used to hide on the upper shelf, the bottle I opened only on special days, and I clinked the glass to her photograph. I don't know why men make rituals out of pain. Maybe it makes it an act and not chaos. I burned some of the old martyrdom notes I'd kept, cards that said, "Thanks, Dad," letters that had turned thin with years, the small things you keep to remind yourself you were supposed to be loved. The fire ate paper in a steady red glow, and I watched the words curl into ash. "Merry Christmas," I told her picture, and for the first time I meant it without the ache. There was a freedom in that moment, cruel and clean, like stepping out of wet clothes on a cold night. Less than 24 hours later, my phone exploded. Olivia called. "Pick my parents up from the airport," she demanded, sharp and furious. "They're coming tonight, and you will do it." The ironies of that voice could have cut glass. Banned from dinner, but expected to act as if domestic servitude had been renamed to family help. I ignored the call. I ignored the texts. I had waited 5 years to stop being their personal bank and bellhop. I would not be their emergency service too. Then something strange happened, something that revealed how small people with influence can twist a story, and how cruelly the rumor mill runs when grease is on the gears. A local paper ran a piece the next morning, a short thing with a headline that felt calibrated to sting. "Local man allegedly abandons elderly visitors at airport." The writer used words like abandoned and neglect, and carried an authoritative voice that made my actions into an accusation. The weather on the day in question was 52 degrees and sunny. The elderly visitors were Olivia's parents, both perfectly capable of pulling a suitcase and sitting in a lobby. The story painted me as a villain, ready-made for the social media drool and the neighborly gossip that followed. At first I read it sideways, the way you glance at a paper you don't want to be in. Then I opened it again. The byline had a name I didn't recognize. I called the reporter. He did not take my call. I called the editor. Nothing. And then I found something ugly. The reporter had connections to Olivia's father, a favored family, a casual exchange of favors. That's when the self I kept for my crew, balanced, patient, not prone to fireworks, left the room. I felt the old contractor's instinct kick in. You don't leave bad work unchecked. You go back, measure what was done, and you correct it. I began to gather things, not to lash out, not to raise a stink, but to build a case as if the truth itself were a structure I planned to trim and make honest. I pulled bank records and highlighted every transfer. I printed receipts for the down payment and the remodel. I found social media posts where Olivia posted photos from vacations, jewelry, and the gleam of sunlight, a kitchen with a tag I remembered telling her to keep. I copied the article and started with a red pen in the margin, a man's way of marking falsehood. I made a list of dates, a spreadsheet, because spreadsheets make things feel less like a wound and more like a project you can finish. It was methodical work. It felt strangely satisfying. For months I had been the person who opened his door at a knock and reached for his wallet at a frown. Suddenly I was a quiet investigator inside my own life. I cross-checked bank statements, traced transfers back to my business account, and printed 12 identical packets, one for each plate I expected would be polished at the dinner table that year. When the packets were done, they made a neat stack on my dining room table. Each one held copies of receipts, screenshots of posts, the printed newspaper article with careful red circles where the lies lived, and an extra sheet where I'd written, "This is what 5 years looks like." I wrapped them in white paper and put them in a briefcase because there was something ceremonial about presenting facts. I kept one packet for myself. The rest I folded into a plan like a set of blueprints. The nights after were long and full of memories and fantasies. I lay awake thinking of ways the world had slotted me outside of its glamour. I thought of Ana's hands folding napkins for a dinner party and of Ethan, as a boy, holding a model house I'd built out of scrap wood. I could feel the old pride rising like heat off a poured foundation. What I had given wasn't a check, but a piece of my life. I had expected gratitude. Instead, I had been given a polite erasure. I told myself the law of fairness was not about money alone. It was about being acknowledged at the table when your hands had built it. The anger that followed wasn't loud. It was a careful, cold planning, the same deliberate hand you use when you measure twice and cut once. I practiced what I would say. I imagined the faces at the table, the way light would catch on a necklace, the way a retired banker might adjust his glasses and look at a column of numbers like they were sinful. There was a quiet joy in the planning, yes, a precise private pleasure at setting in order what had been allowed to be messy for too long. But there was also terror. I worried, would I be the monster in my son's eyes? Did I risk losing the possibility of a relationship that might someday be redeemed? I slept badly, thinking about whether there were other ways, therapy, conversation, time, but the silence of those months had said, everything to me. When a man has his face turned away from the warmth he built, sometimes he chooses to stop warming the stove. The packet sat there for a week, and then a knock came on my door the morning of Christmas Eve. Ethan had called an hour earlier and said he needed to stop by. My hands tightened around the mug in a way I hadn't felt since the hospital. I thought of the photograph of Anna, of the kitchen clock that kept a steady tempo, of all the small things I had been told were the price of being a good father. I dressed in my navy suit, the one I had worn to Anna's funeral, and I placed the briefcase beside the front door, because there are moments when a man should be the truest version of himself. When I walked into their dining room that evening, there was a chandelier like a crown and a long table, polished smooth. Plates were set with the same perfect alignment I had seen in gift catalogs. There were 12 people already laughing, the kind of laugh that has been cultured. I remember the bright scent of pine, the low hum of conversation, a glass tinkling as someone made a toast. I can still feel the weight of that briefcase in my hand. I can still see Olivia's smile flicker when I walked in. When I set the briefcase on the sideboard, it made a sound like something heavy and unavoidable settling into place. My heart was not racing. My hands were not shaking. I had rehearsed what I would do like a carpenter rehearses a cut. Olivia moved toward me, an instinct to direct, to eject, a hostess's confidence. "Dad, maybe this isn't," she started. I began to hand out packets. "Here are 5 years of mortgage payments," I said, and let the sentence rest in the air like a beam. The room was suddenly listening to a different radio. People took the envelopes with curiosity that sharpened into shock as they read. They read the dates, the numbers, the notes I had written in the margin. December transfer, kitchen remodel. You could see the laughter leave their faces like steam. Then I placed copies of the newspaper article on the table, and with a red pen, I circled the lies. The world of polished appearances did what appearances do. It faltered when shown the truth. A retired banker looked up from a page and frowned. A supply store owner who'd once nodded in recognition of my crew's work reached for his glasses. Olivia's face went white. Ethan's eyes filled with something like shame, and he couldn't find the words. I spoke in a voice calm enough to be frightening. "This is the last dinner I'll ever be paying for," I said. The sentence came out soft, but it was a line drawn in rock. Then I left. You don't always know in the moment how a thing will land. You can plan, you can measure, but how pride splits and how reputations unravel are things you learn as you watch. I stepped into the cold night and felt the winter bite like a truth. I walked home to my empty house with the briefcase lighter, and the kitchen clock went on marking time, as if nothing had happened at all. The cliff didn't snap closed that night. It began to close slowly, the way a door closes when the wind is at your back. I went to sleep with the house drafty, and the new lightness of someone who had thrown down a gauntlet. I had made a choice that would, in ways I hadn't yet seen, change everything. But that change I knew, and the careful work that would follow, was larger than the packet in my briefcase. It was about dignity. It was about what a father is willing to lose to stop being someone's invisible benefactor. I had lit a small fire when I burned the notes. Now it was time to see whether the story I had told the neighborhood would burn away the polished illusion they had built. And that's when the real trouble, the slow, merciless fallout, began. The night after I left the dinner, the wind had a hard winter edge. I walked home under a sky that looked like a bruise, and the street lights threw the neat shadows of bare trees across the pavement. Inside, the house smelled of the roast I'd been too late to taste at their table, and the faint citrus of dish soap. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table like a man who has finished a long job and is waiting to see if the scaffolding holds. The first week was odd in a way I hadn't expected. I thought people would call friends, neighbors, maybe Ethan, demanding explanations or apologies. There were a few texts that first morning, short and sharp, from Olivia. "You made a scene," one said. "You embarrassed us." There were other messages with the polite heat of entitlement. "You could have handled this privately." I read them in the quiet, and sometimes the voice I heard behind the text was my son, or a version of him I wanted to believe in. Then the phone started doing the thing it does when a small pebble rolls and gathers speed. It filled with voices that were not mine to carry. Friends of theirs called the house and asked the kind of questions you ask when you are already forming an opinion. Is everything okay? Did something happen with Olivia's parents? The neighbors asked things in the grocery store line. Small talk became a place where my name could be pushed and steadied like a coin. More dangerously, the local grapevine did what it does best. It turned my gesture into a narrative that suited the crowd. "He's a stubborn old man," someone said. "He wanted credit for everything. He's making a point. Social opinion is a beast you can't always tame. It eats the facts you hand it and spits out a version that is tastier to chew." There were whispers that I had come in drunk to their dinner, that I had raised my voice, that I was cruel. None of it was true. None of it was true? Or if there were slivers of truth, a raised tone, a sharp phrase, they had been chosen by hurt, not by malice. But hurt makes a better headline than context. The paper's article kept surfacing. Every time I saw the name in print, I felt a dry, numbing anger. Whoever had written it had chosen to omit the transfers, the down payment, the remodel receipts. Whoever had stitched that story together had made me into the kind of villain that needed no face-to-face rebuttal. It was comfortable for those who wanted a villain because a villain is neat. Heroes are messy. I began to watch the slow math of consequence. The first bank notices arrived at their house like small official avalanches. Late payment warnings, a terse letter from a mortgage company that assumed its customers were uncooperative rather than abandoned. I printed one copy and stapled it into my file. There were other things I filed: the kitchen receipt, the down payment check stub, a photograph of Ethan and Olivia on their wedding day, where he was smiling so openly you could see how wide his heart had once been. I had always paid my men on Fridays. I used to tell them that a payday is a promise kept. When the first of my crew came by the shop and asked me about the dinner, Miguel with a cigarette tucked in his lip, Thomas with a smear of paint on his knuckles, I saw myself outside of a story and watched how they stared at me like a man asking directions. Miguel nodded once and then said slowly, "You did the right thing, Carlos. Don't let folks use you." It was kind, and it was also not enough. The thing that surprised me most was how the silence could feel like an accusation. See, when you cut off asking money, people do not always rush to meet you halfway with gratitude. Some of them stand up straighter and keep walking like a man who had been propped up by your hands and can now balance. For others, the loss is immediate and tangible. For Ethan and Olivia, I could see it happening in little ways. Missed dates, unpaid bills, the way the garbage got a week behind because they were trimming corners. They tried other things first. Olivia called my brother-in-law, apparently, and with the kind of persuasive voice that can make a story sound verifiable, she framed me as a man who had made a show. Then she went to friends asking for loans, people who believed in lifestyle instead of ledgers. Someone suggested a GoFundMe to help them through a rough patch, which made me sick. A fundraiser to save a life of privilege that had been underwritten by the sweat of one man, by me. Their friends did what friends sometimes do. They faced a choice between peer support and the messy truth of money. Many chose to keep the calendar and attend parties as if nothing was happening. It was easier to maintain an image than to write a check. The note came then from the mortgage company, a polite "we notice a pattern" and a flyer about co-signed loans. A second notice gave the date, a stern, clinical number in small print that began to make things real. The weeks turned and the notices built like storm clouds. I watched all this from my kitchen window on a Tuesday afternoon with a mug in my hands. I thought about calling Ethan, telling him I would resume payments if he needed me to bridge 1 month. Part of me wanted to fix it. Part of me wanted them to feel what it was like to meet bills without invisible help. It was a complicated feeling, justice braided with a selfishness that admitted to pleasure at their discomfort. One morning, a man from the bank came by my office and asked if I could come down to the branch. I thought perhaps they wanted to discuss how a large account transfer had been stopped, a bureaucratic question. The teller looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. She showed me a printout of the mortgage's status and said, "Sir, there are late fees accumulating. If this continues, they may go into default." I felt something cold and precise settle in my chest. "Is there anything you can do?" she asked, like someone offering the small, last-handed rope to throw to a figure in the tide. I thought of Ana and the way she used to tie scarves and make lists. Would she have told me to step forward and bail them out? Maybe, but she would have also told me that your dignity is not a number to be mortgaged for a photograph. I told the teller nothing and watched the paper as if the ink might rearrange. The neighborhood began to shift, too. Invitations that had been automatic no longer came. When I ran into people at Rosa's who cared for me like a sister and cooked like a woman who believed in love as a meal, there were awkward beats. Some neighbors avoided my eye, evidently embarrassed to be associated with whatever they decided the story to be. Others quietly stayed to talk. Mr. Patel from the hardware store pulled me aside and said, "We always knew you were a good man." That meant more to me than any front-page pity. At night, the house echoed with memories. There were moments when I woke up and could swear Ana was in the doorway, folding a napkin or laughing at some private thing. I would reach for my phone and see missed calls. Sometimes it was only spam. Sometimes it was Ethan calling and then hanging up, a slow friction where the phone becomes something too heavy to hold. Ethan called once in the early days, his voice trembling like a leaf. "Dad, why did you do that?" he said. "You humiliated us in front of everyone." There was anger in it, not for the dinner so much as for the wound he'd felt exposed. "I told them to keep you away," he said, which sounded like a confession even as it was an accusation. I told him then what I told him later. "You can apologize to me, but I won't be the one who pays to keep you acceptable." When the missed payments kept building, the landscape of their life began to show its seams. Electricity notices, a note from the HOA, a plumber's invoice tucked on the counter. I watched their social media like a man watching a parade, where the dancers had tripped on the hem of their costumes. Olivia posted photographs with captions that rang hollow to me now. Boomerang videos, brunch with girlfriends, the chirpy smiles of people performing calm. I had proof that she had been buying small luxuries while their accounts were crawling with red. The evidence burned in a file, but seeing it was not the same as causing it. Then the whispers in town turned toward the parents, Olivia's parents, who had been at the center of the smear. They were not immune to the stare of neighbors who now wondered if there had been a hand guiding a reporter's pen. It's amazing how quickly privilege can retreat into its shell when the comfortable narrative that upheld it is questioned. People began to talk about favoritism and planted stories as gossip turned investigative. Someone at the local bakery mentioned a conversation overheard, a joke about having strings. A neighbor who twice lent their truck for an event said that she'd seen Olivia's father laughing at a table where the reporter had been invited over. Rumors will not convict anyone, but they will, if they gather enough momentum, make those who were previously tentative about speaking up suddenly feel less isolated. The retired banker who'd been at my dinner reached out to a friend and asked if there was any record of the article's sourcing. A clerk at City Hall, the woman who stacks files like dominoes, told me behind a closed door that she'd been asked by someone to look into a set of emails between a reporter and one of Olivia's father's associates. I didn't follow it far, she said, but there's smoke. Smoke is not fire, but smoke signals a disturbance. Meanwhile, Ethan's posture with me had shifted. He came by one afternoon with a look like a man 10 years older. He knocked and stood awkwardly on the porch while I opened the door. His shirt was wrinkled. His eyes were hollow in a way I had seen on the faces of men who visited emergency rooms and didn't know what to ask. "Dad," he said, and the voice carried the weight of small apologies. He wanted to know if I would transfer money again. I saw the math on his face, the calculations one makes when the mortgage calls and the late fees begin to add up. I told him I wouldn't resume automatic payments. I told him he had choices. He could ask us, his family, to live with less. He could go to the bank and work out something, or he could ask his wife's parents to help. He looked as if he had no idea how to ask any of those things with his chest intact. The uglier part of it, the thing that was hardest to watch, was how easily the people who had been polite in the dining room began to retreat from their attendance at Olivia and Ethan's problems when the price of association rose. Those who had once accepted invitations and contributed nothing now had to consider whether their calendar entries would be hypocritical. When the bank's letters switched from late to notice of default, people who used to nod at the sight of their home now had to decide whether to befriend, pity, or avoid. For all that, there were small gestures of decency that kept me steady. Rosa invited me to dinner more than once, as if to remind me that some tables have room without a receipt. Miguel came with a jar of cookies when he could afford them. An old client, Mrs. Kramer, dropped off a plate of pastry left over from a luncheon and said warmly, "You taught my son how to hang a door right." Don't lose that. Those moments felt like the good parts of what I'd built. The people who had been in my life before headlines, before glare, before mortgages and receipts. And yet the bank did its work like a quiet, mechanical tide. Notices turned to demands. The property manager took a polite call with a voice that had been trained for these things. "Mr. Mendoza," he said, "we would like to avoid foreclosure, but if the payments are not brought up to date, we will begin proceedings." It was the kind of sentence that strips life into calendar entries. I confess I watched the foreclosure process a little like a man watching a storm approach. There was a thrill to it. Yes, I had done what I intended. I had stopped pouring my savings into a life that treated me as invisible. But there was also a hardness at the base of my chest that felt like regret. What kind of father, I wondered in the small hours, sets a test like this and sits to see if his children will pass it? Was I too proud? Was dignity a luxury I could afford on the backs of a boy who had once been soft with me? The town began to ask itself questions. Did we know the whole story about the article? Did we know how many transfers had been made? People who loved spectacle also loved fairness. Gradually, those who had been dazzled by the polished living room started to notice cracks, unpaid notices in mailboxes, a gardener unpaid for a month, a child school fundraiser donation that stopped arriving. The people who once applauded the chandeliers began to define themselves by whether they would stand with the hammered man who had been pushed out. Days blurred into a season. Winter settled into the corners. I kept busy at the shop because work is a steady thing that has no interest in our moral ambiguities. Boards need cutting, nails need hammering, men need payment. The men at the yard would ask how I felt, and I'd tell them the truth in a way that didn't flatter. It's complicated, I'd say, and it was. Then, 97 days after the packets were handed out and the briefcase had made the sound of a weight finally set down, there was a knock at my door in the late afternoon. The light slanted low and golden across the porch. I had been oiling a tool, a small ritual I have performed for years, and I set it down deliberately, as if the act would steady whatever came next. When I opened the door, Ethan stood there. He looked 10 years older than the last time he'd seen me, with his head high. There was a look on his face like one of those men who have been stripped of a performance and left with something raw beneath. He swallowed and said haltingly, "Dad, can I come in?" I let him. The house smelled like wood shavings and lemon oil. He shuffled his feet and looked at the table as if he might not dare sit. "I'm sorry," he began, and in those two little words I could hear months. Fear, regret, shame, the slow unraveling of a life someone else had built for them. He spoke of ignorance, of humbling conversations with his wife's parents, of learning things that made him angry and small in the same breath. He spoke of the mortgage notices, of late fees that had ballooned, of friends who had drifted away. There was so much I wanted to say that was not angry, and there was much I wanted to say that was, but the part I wanted him to hear was not about dollars. "Ethan," I told him quietly, "I forgave you a while ago. Forgiveness is not a checkbook. You will have to be a man who comes back into his father's life by earning it, not buying it." He looked at me then as if he were searching for the place where his childhood had been left and could not find it. The words he said next felt like the hinge on which the rest of our story might swing. "I don't know how to live without you helping." The sentence closed the room in a way I didn't anticipate. It sat there, heavy and human. I could see the boy he had been, the one who scraped knees on my construction sites and who once wanted to build things with me. And I could see the man he had become, who had been taught by others that family can be outsourced. He left after that. He did not beg. He spoke like someone who had been robbed of his own center. I watched him walk down the path, and the wood of the porch creaked the way it had the night Ana had died when the house felt like an empty, hollow vessel. That night I sat with the kitchen light on and drank straight from the bottle Ana used to hide. I thought about the months behind me, The receipts, the packets, the journalists, the way people had looked when truth was put on a table. I thought about what I had lost and what I had gained. There was a cost. The house they had would soon be at risk. There was also a weight lifted, a dignity that felt like a slow return to a posture I had forgotten I was allowed to wear. And yet, as the clock marked the late hour and the winter wind pressed at the panes, I felt the way a man feels before he decides whether to make peace or hold to principle. Outside, the world of their lives was fracturing in ways I had intended but not relished. Inside, my heart turned the question over like a coin. I went to bed with that question still warm in my hands. The storm had not yet decided whether it would be a cleansing rain or a ruin. I slept with the knowledge that something more would come, an ending that would not be neat, and in the morning I would wake to a town that had been rearranged by my choice. But the town does not move on a single morning. It moves with time. And time, as I would learn in the days after Ethan's confession, had a way of carving truth into places where people had once only polished surface. For a while after Ethan left my porch that day, I felt like a man standing at the edge of a scaffolding, looking down at the street and deciding whether to climb back up or come down completely. The shop kept me honest. There was always a wall that needed fixing, a roof that needed measuring. The men relied on me to be practical and punctual. But when the last truck rolled out and the yard quieted, the edges of my mind filled with the task I had set myself. Not to punish for the sake of punishment, but to make the truth visible, to let dignity settle where it belonged. There's a particular clarity that comes when you map out injustice the way a mason maps a wall. You lay your stones in rows. You run a plumb line and a level. That's how I approached it. I sharpened my facts the way I sharpen tools. I read through the bank statements until the numbers stopped being distant. They became instead an old rhythm I could hum. The date of each transfer, the decimal locations, the memo lines where I'd written mortgage help or for Ethan. I wanted every figure indisputable. I didn't want to rely on gossip. I wanted proof that would stand between me and the convenience of people's short attention spans. I began calling people quietly, not for favors or to enlist a posse. I wanted context. I called the editor of the paper who had run that ugly piece. He returned my call with the practiced calm of someone who has spent too long behind a desk. "Mr. Mendoza," he said, "we stand by our story." I told him gently that nobody had stood by my side and asked to see the documentation. He hemmed and hawed, said the reporter had sources. "Can you put me in touch with them?" I asked. He said he would look into it. He never did. If the paper refused to correct the record, the town still had its people. I went to Mr. Patel at the hardware store. He'd seen my men hauling floorboards into a house 5 years ago. He slid me a cup of coffee and said, "You want to be heard? Get accounts. Show folks what money looks like when it's moved." He gave me names of people who had been at that dinner, not to browbeat them, but because people respect receipts. If you hand a man his own signature and the amount he wrote, there's no place left for polite fiction. So I reshaped my briefcase. The 12 packets that had once been ceremonial needed to become a campaign not of malice, but of clarity. I divided them differently now. A packet for neighbors, a packet for the editor, a packet for the bank managers, a packet for the HOA, and for the retired banker. Each packet contained copies of every transfer, annotated with my handwriting, December 2019, $2,600. Mortgage assistance. I included bank confirmation numbers. I printed screenshots of Olivia's posts, not to shame anyone gratuitously, but to show the weird contrast of lifestyle and unpaid notes. I enlarged the photograph of Ethan and Olivia at their wedding and underlined the date when the first payments began. Evidence, not theater. Planning revenge was not the same thing as joy. Some nights I felt a small, bitter pleasure in the idea that the truth would unsettle them, that their polished lives would be rearranged. Other nights I lay awake thinking of Ethan's hollow face and wondered if I had crossed a line that meant trespassing into something irreparable, the father and son quiet that sometimes returns only with a miracle. I toyed with the idea of writing Ethan a letter, pouring out everything in a single page. But letters are different from packets. Letters beg for response. Packets make statements. There were logistical puzzles. One was timing. If I wanted the packets to land when they would be most visible, when the chandelier would be full and the town's gossip would have an appetite, Christmas Eve was the obvious choice. That was the evening when their social calendar would be full, when guests who counted themselves important would be in attendance, when a family's cracks are most likely to show because everyone is watching and evaluating. It was cruel, perhaps, but it was also theatrical in the sense that truth, when it is revealed under the very chandeliers it never paid for, exposes the fissures for what they are. Another puzzle was emotion. I feared turning the event into spectacle in a way that would make me look petty. I had no desire to yell or to call out names in a way that would feed tabloids. The packets were designed to do the work for me. Numbers don't shout, they sit, they stare back. And when numbers are yours and receipts bear your name, they have a particular lonely force. I also needed allies, not to fight my battle, but to witness it. Witnesses make truth less easy to gaslight. The retired banker, Mr. Hargreaves, was one such ally. He had been at the dinner and had the kind of restrained personality that when he raised a brow, people listened. He and I had spoken once after I handed out the packets. I told him quietly what I planned to do. He didn't promise to speak. He simply said, "I'll be on the porch." In my world, that was better than a speech. It was someone who would not let the moment dissolve into a fiction. I practiced my speech in the workshop, using the table where we scribed lines for cuts as my podium. I kept the words spare. This is what 5 years looks like, I would say. Not so the words would land like a hammer, but so they'd feel inevitable. I wanted to show, not dramatize. I wanted to offer people a chance to change their mind by reading the facts. There were close calls. A contractor who worked with Olivia's parents mentioned that he had heard a disagreement between them and the reporter, a chat about schedule and favors. I called him and he admitted to overhearing, but he also said he didn't want to get involved. It wasn't his fight. In another moment I nearly gave in to a softer option, a meeting with Ethan in the office, 2 men and a cup of coffee, a quiet negotiation. But Ethan's initial defense, the "I didn't know" line, had felt like a shield that allowed him to step away from the consequences of a life he had helped construct. I needed the town, not a private conversation, to see what had been happening while they were busy applauding. There were also moments when a doubt crept in like black mold in a basement. What if this turned them into martyrs? What if the town decided to protect the image of a young family against the old man who made them? What if I lost Ethan forever? Those fears felt like knives. Sometimes they pressed deeper than the angry heat of being used. On a damp night, as I drove home from the shop, I almost came to a decision to reach into my account and resume payments for 1 month while I tried a softer approach. The steering wheel felt cold under my palms. I turned onto my street, and the lamplight caught the scar on my knuckle where I had split wood for a porch railing years ago. I thought of every man I'd employed who kept houses together for a living. I thought of Ana and the sort of small internal courage she always had. I could not turn back. One of the things people forget about planning is the tiny, petty logistics. Printing, envelopes, the smell of paper, the slant of black ink on cheap cardstock. I took the packets to the copy shop and watched as the machine chewed them out one by one. The machine's hum calmed me in a way that was almost absurd. We are creatures who can be calmed by routine, even when we prepare for confrontation. I paid cash for the copies because I didn't want any traceable electronic receipts beyond what I'd already gathered. It was a small, almost insignificant detail, but one I liked because I had leaned on the principle of doing things properly. And then, finally, the week of the dinner arrived. My hands were steady in a way that surprised me. I wore my navy suit out of habit. It was the suit that matched the weight I intended to carry. I arrived at their house with my briefcase and the packets inside, neat as surgical tools. The air that evening was sharp. The house looked like a stage, polished and expecting applause. The long table gleamed under the chandelier. The guests were gossip's chosen audience, the retired banker, a couple of neighbors, Olivia's parents with their polite air of having set a standard. I could feel the way the room leaned into appearances, like a listener leans into the end of a story. I had rehearsed this. I had a cadence I had practiced in the shop. I set the briefcase down on the sideboard, as if any other man might have set down a box of cookies. I looked at the faces around the room. Some were familiar and friendly, others were brittle with the kind of refinement that has been cultivated for years. When Olivia began to move to the door to show me the place, the same way you'd point out an artful detail to a museum guest, I stood and handed packets out quietly, deliberately. The hush came slow. People read. Eyes moved. The retired banker folded his glasses and did not look away. I told Ethan quietly, "This is the last dinner I'll pay for." He tried to interrupt. Olivia made a noise like a cough. I walked out before words could spoil the moment. That night, I slept with the knowledge that I had let the town see me. I wasn't certain how they would interpret what I'd done. I had not shouted. I had not embarrassed without evidence. I had done what men like me do when they choose to set a boundary. We measure, we plan, and we deliver. But the plan had another layer I hadn't yet revealed to anyone. I had made copies of each packet and prepared a separate folder, a compiled dossier that included not only transfers and receipts, but also a simple ledger I had made showing the cumulative total I had paid into their life, $228,200. I wasn't going to put the number on a napkin and fling it about the room. Numbers are more terrifying when allowed to sit in a bank of silence. I planned to send the dossier to 3 places: the bank, the local paper, and a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse cases. Not because I wanted to ruin anyone's life with charges, but because I wanted the institutions that mattered to see what had been happening. Money moves create legal footprints. I would not leave this to gossip. There was a quiet satisfaction in that part of the plan. It was not cruelty, it was a finality. I wanted the institutions that had the capacity to act to be aware. If someone takes advantage of a man who is at once father, provider, and vulnerable, then the law, the community, or even a bank's policy could do something. I wanted consequences to be available for anyone who thought they could simply rearrange a story to their advantage. Before I sealed the envelopes and sent the dossiers by certified mail, I made one final call. It was to Miguel. "If people ask," I said, "tell them the truth. Not for me. For your kids." He laughed softly, a sound warm with something like relief. "I'll tell them," he said. "You did right, Carlos." Sending the dossiers felt like dropping a stone in a still pond. The ripples would show where the water would respond. I mailed them, and in doing so, set in motion, not a spectacle, but an inquiry. Maybe a legal inquiry would be too strong. Maybe it would do nothing, but it had to be done. A day later, the bank called me. Someone at the mortgage company had received my packet and wanted answers, if not about the money they already had in their hands, then about the way loans had been held and whose names were in the ledgers. The editor of the paper called me back for the first time in weeks and said, in a voice smoother than the one I'd heard before, "We'd like to correct the record. Would you come down and speak?" When institutions begin to ask questions, people find it harder to hide behind a dinner table. The calm of a town in winter started to crack in small, legal ways. The reporter who had written the original story was quieter. Someone from the paper asked if they could quote my dossier in a follow-up. I hesitated only a moment before I agreed. I wanted the truth to be told without the flourish of my anger. But even as the gears of institutional attention started moving, I felt an internal friction I had not fully anticipated. There is a loneliness to being right in public. People who had once been polite in the flesh now sent cold messages. Olivia called that night and left a voicemail that was equal parts wounded and furious, saying, "You don't get to rewrite our story." Ethan texted and wrote simply, "We need to talk." I did not return either message that night. I wanted the town to decide what it did with the documents, not me to demand a particular outcome. The turning point had become a process. The packets were not the climax, they were the pivot. From that point, the rest would be about watching institutions and neighbors and our small town react. I had done what I could. I had made the receipts legible. The rest was, for the first time in months, not entirely mine to perform. And yet I slept with a stubborn, slow hope that somehow truth would coax Ethan back to the man he once was, not the man judged by another's approval, but the boy I remembered holding a model house made of scrap wood, proud of the way the roof met the walls. I would not call that naive. It was simply something I could not give up. The packets had been delivered, the dossiers sent, the phone calls made. There was nothing more to arrange but the way the town would respond. I settled in for that watch, a watch that would ask everyone involved in one way or another, what family means when money buys the illusion of it. The next move would not be mine alone. When I went to bed that night, the house hummed with a different sound. Not just the clock's measured tick, but like a town's whispering breath before a storm. I slept badly, but I slept with the feeling that a path had been set. The rest, I told myself, was a matter of time and patience. And if time had taught me anything, it was that patience saved more things than sudden fury ever had. The cliffhanger I left myself with. The moment before the town would begin to judge more than appearances was not dramatic. It was an impatient, quiet thing. Would the paper correct the lie? Would the bank act? Would Ethan step into the room and choose to be a son instead of a spokesman for someone else's idea of success? Only time would tell. When the town's whispering began to change shape, it sounded less like gossip and more like a slow, hungry tide. The certified letters had gone out. The bank had received the dossier and, for reasons that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with policy, opened an internal review. The paper ran a quiet follow-up piece, not on my front door or my marbles, but on facts. They printed a timeline. They printed copies of transfers. They printed my name next to numbers and dates, and for once the ink favored truth. I woke the morning that article ran and felt a peculiar looseness in my chest. The house smelled like lemon, oil, and wood, the old comforting smell of things I had made by hand, and for a brief moment I thought the world had simply righted itself. That was naive. The world does not right itself in neat acts. It rearranges, sometimes painfully, and people's faces change along with it. Calls began coming in, not the sharp, prickly ones from Olivia, but from people I hadn't spoken to in years. An old client asked if I'd like to bid on a job. A neighbor left a casserole on my steps. Mr. Hargreaves, the retired banker, came by with a soft, careful smile and a pack of cigars like an awkward apology turned into support. "You handled it well," he said, tapping the briefcase that had sat under his porch the night of the dinner. He did not mean I had been theatrical. He meant that I had brought light to something that had been too easily hidden. There were uglier things, too. My phone filled with voicemails from people I'd never thought would call, men who liked the aesthetic of success and decided they needed to defend it. "How dare you?" one voice said with brittle rage. "You could have done this privately." Another left a message that ended with the soft, scalding contempt of someone convinced they'd been betrayed. Let them speak, I told myself aloud. Let them make what noise they want. The town is loud sometimes. It forgets the quiet facts we keep in a safe. The bank's review moved in its measured, bureaucratic way. Banks have ledgers, they have rules, they have thresholds where they must act. When the mortgage company called the property manager at Ethan's house, they found late fees, then notices, then an account in a thin red. The property manager made a note. 5 payments missed. The bank's legal team wrote a letter to the homeowners, formally notifying them of the default risk. The letter was not cruel. It was precise, clinical, the language of corporations that have no patience for drama. I watched from my porch a man who had set a bowl of truth on a table and now waited to see who would pick it up. Olivia's parents were not immune to the scrutiny. A few people who had once attended their garden parties made awkward telephone calls to friends and, in the same breath, asked about sources. The reporter who'd first written the malicious piece was quieter in town. He did not stop by the hardware store to pick up novelty opinion. When he walked past me once on Main Street, he kept his head down. That, too, felt like a kind of justice, small, perhaps, but honest. The hardest fallout, of course, was private. I received letters from collection agencies, generic, official, their envelopes thick with formality. Ethan called the night one of the first foreclosure notices landed in his mailbox. "Dad," he whispered into the line, "they're starting proceedings." I don't know what to do. In those moments, the old man inside me, the one who had once stayed up nights calculating payrolls and insurance costs, wanted to step in and patch the roof. The other man, the man who had felt invisible for years, wanted to stand fast. The argument between those two was a sharp one. I remembered Ana's voice in the hallway, telling me to be fair and to be kind. I thought about the years of transfers, about the many evenings I had spent imagining their breakfasts, their anniversaries, the life I had underwritten with checks and quiet pride. "You're their son," I said finally, keeping my voice steady. "You will have to make some choices. I can't be a checkbook that buys approval. If you want me in your life, you will find a way to be in mine, not as someone who helps pay for appearances, but as a son." The next morning, a woman from the mortgage company's office called me. "Mr. Mendoza," she said, "we received your packet. We noticed the transfers. We also noticed several unusual patterns of assistance that raise questions about financial arrangements and responsibilities for adult children." Her voice was that of a bureaucrat who had been trained to be neutral and factual, but her words carried weight. Institutions, when they notice patterns, can ask questions that friends don't. There was a meeting at the branch weeks later. The mortgage company offered to open a mediation session between the homeowners and the bank. It wasn't a rescue. It was a doorway to negotiating terms, to finding a way to remediate debts. Someone at the bank who had read the dossier and could not unsee the pattern we'd laid out had agreed to listen. The mediation saved the house from immediate foreclosure, for now, with a plan that required both Ethan and Olivia to accept a repayment schedule and make a concerted effort to rebalance their budget. The bank's intervention did not absolve them of responsibility, but it did make room for choices. If the bank's procedural intervention felt like a public acknowledgment of what my packets had done, the town's social reaction was quieter and more personal. Invitations that used to come casually no longer arrived without consideration. People began asking questions about how they'd shown up. A neighbor who once complimented Olivia on her crystal came to the shop and with red eyes apologized. "We didn't know," she said. "We never looked. Of all the things that shifted, none moved as slowly or as painfully as Ethan. He called me every few days, tentative, as if he were walking on something fragile and looking for a place to step. Some of the calls were practical. "What's this line for on the ledger?" he would ask, and I'd explain. Others were oddly intimate. "Do you remember when I broke my arm?" he would say, and we would find the slot in our memory that still had the same thread. He was, little by little, returning to the language of family. It was not instantaneous, and it was not neat. One afternoon, 97 days after I had handed out the first packet, there was a knock on my door. It surprised me because I had stopped expecting grand gestures. When I opened it, Ethan stood there in his same rumpled shirt, his eyes damp as if he'd been crying. He looked 10 years older, not by time, but by wear. "Dad," he began, voice like gravel. "I'm sorry," he faltered, as men do when they reach a word that will not mend what they have broken in a single utterance. He told me about humiliating conversations he'd had with Olivia's parents, about the way they had spoken about Ana and me, as if our life had been a temporary fix, an inheritance they had assumed would be squandered unless polished away. He told me he'd been ashamed to defend me because he didn't want to lose the life he'd started to love. He told me he had wanted to belong. I poured him tea, the way my mother used to do when the house needed warming. "Ethan," I said, setting the cup down, "I forgive you, but forgiveness is not a reset. It doesn't make the decisions disappear. It doesn't make the money appear out of thin air. He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who once built model houses with me and now signed papers because someone told him wealth looked a certain way. "Can I come back?" he asked, in a voice that sounded like a child asking permission to join a game. "You can come back," I said, "but come in with the same hands you used to have. Come as the son I raised, not as a man who wants the light of other people's approval more than his father's love." The apology was clumsy and real. We spoke for hours that day about pride, about the pressure to maintain an image, about the small brutalities of social climbing. I told him about the nights I had lain awake, thinking of the dinners and the way people treated us. I told him about the briefcase and why I'd chosen to hand out those packets. He listened as men sometimes need to, with their mouths closed and their old soft parts uncovered. A slow reconciliation began. It was not a cinematic reconciliation where hugs and tears resolve everything. It was more like someone rebuilding a fence, post by post, board by board. Ethan began to show up at the shop sometimes, not to collect a check, but to help on a job. He repainted a fence and put up a railing at Rose's house. He paid a neighbor for a service instead of assuming I'd cover it. I watched him relearn how to be a man in the modest, practical ways that matter. Olivia, for her part, retreated into a place of indignation for longer. She stopped posting the glossy brunch pictures for a while. In the months that followed, I heard through mutual contacts that there had been strained conversations between her and her parents. She had to accept that their story had been a performance that worked when someone else signed the checks. At some point, she and Ethan had to decide whether they would accept a life with new limits or seek comfort from family who had never paid a mortgage for them. I should say this plainly: the town did not immediately shower me with applause. Some people still called me stubborn. Some people whispered that I was harsh. The world is full of contradiction. We do not become saints simply because we were taken for granted. But the arc of public opinion shifted enough that people began to ask uncomfortable questions about how we value one another. There were conversations about entitlement and compassion in the hardware store and at the coffee shop. The narrative shifted from grinchy old man to man whose generosity had been exploited. That shift saved me from becoming the caricature the original article had tried to make me. Months later, when the mortgage had been restructured and Ethan and Olivia held to a repayment plan, things calmed. The house did not change its address, but someone else had to help with the budget and with the discipline that money requires. I resumed a relationship with my son that was tentative and better for its caution. He earned his place back not with checks, but by showing up in small, honest ways. There was one final social repercussion that was quieter, but to me it felt substantial. Olivia's father, the man who had leaned on influence like a cane, began to find invitations less frequent. The people who had nodded at his garden parties found themselves sitting at new tables, ones where they asked different questions before they toasted. I watched as someone who had been used to steering conversations discovered that stories have consequences when other people are allowed to speak. And me? I lost money in the ledger. That is a fact I will not sugarcoat. Hundreds of thousands of dollars I might have invested, or set aside for retirement, or used to expand the business into something bigger. Money that went into a life that treated me politely, but not lovingly, was gone. But I gained something else, a posture that felt like the old man I used to be when Ana was alive, neither diminished nor apologetic. There were nights, in the quiet that followed, when I'd sit on the back porch with a glass of whiskey and remember the good parts of what we'd had. Ina's laugh, the smell of coffee at dawn, the sound of boards hitting a nail like a steady heartbeat. I thought often of the men I'd employed, of the kids who would grow up to have their own small businesses, of the way money can make people either small or brave. If there is a scent that stays with me from that whole season, it is the smell of paper and ink, the smell of packets that had forced a conversation. It was not elegant, it was honest. The legal threats never came. The reporter who had written the initial story left town for another paper a few months later. Rumor had it he'd been reprimanded for failing to vet a source. I have no satisfaction in another man's failure. I took the rightness of my actions for their own sake, not as pleasure at someone else's misstep. On the 1-year mark, I went over to Ethan and Olivia's for dinner, an invitation that surprised me. The table was modest. There were fewer crystal trimmings and smaller platters of food. Ethan served with a face like a man who had learned how to set a table, not to impress, but to feed. Olivia looked less performative and more tired, perhaps, but also more human. She came up to me and said, simply, "Thank you for not backing down." I felt the words like an old scarf, warm and worn and oddly comforting. That night I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I let myself be present, not as an ATM, not as a project, just as a father. We ate with no pretense. We spoke of mundane things. We spoke of the kids who were growing up down the block. We laughed once or twice at a private joke about a dog that used to chase my truck. I didn't need a parade. I didn't need grand apologies. I had wanted for years to be seen. That night I felt seen. If you are listening to this and you have been the one always paying, keep your receipts. I don't mean that literally, though if you're doing transfers and gifts, record them. I mean keep the record of your life. Know where your money goes and why. Money is not only currency. It is a test of who we are willing to be for others. If you are constantly giving and being resisted, ask yourself whether your gift is enabling a version of someone else you don't like. There is bravery in stepping back. If you're the child in this story, hear me plainly. Nobody raised us to be silent credit lines. Being loved and being bankrolled are different things. Learn to be a person who can hold a place at the table without another's checkbook paying for the chair. There is dignity in reckoning with the life you build, even if it means smaller plates and fewer garden parties. I lost money. I lost years I might have spent softer, perhaps, or invested differently. But I gained back something I had misplaced. Not my money, but my dignity. I discovered that the texture of a life is not how much is spent on its frame, but who sits at it willingly. Family, true family, is not measured in invoices, but in the people who call because they want your company, and not because they want your signature. I tell this story not to revel in revenge, but to show how truth and patience, when combined with the courage to set boundaries, can remake a life. Revenge in this story was quiet, proportionate, and weighted with documentation. It was not an act of malice. It was an act of clarifying what was owed, not as a ledger to punish, but as a light to insist the facts be seen. I've kept going. The business hums. The men who work for me still come on Fridays to get paid. Rosa still calls me for Sunday dinner. The house on their street still has lights in the window at Christmas. Ethan and I speak more honestly now. He comes by the shop sometimes. He doesn't need a check to be my son. He needs his hands back. If any of you have been treating your parents like a TM's, stop. Keep the receipts. Know your worth. And if you are the parent, remember that sometimes love without limits becomes a ticket for someone else to write their life for them. It's okay to step back. It's okay to make dignity part of your retirement. One night a year later, I sat on the porch and watched a young couple walk down the sidewalk holding hands. I thought of my own mistakes, of the ease with which we can hand over our power to people who will not respect it. I thought of Aina and the many small ways she taught me to be kinder. There is always a line to walk between generosity and self-erasure. I don't pretend I walked it perfectly. I only know where I stand now. Little less wealthy, infinitely more myself. If this story hit a nerve, whether you're the giver, the taker, or someone who's been watching from the side, drop a like and subscribe. Share your story below if you've ever had to set a boundary that cost you. Tell me, did I do the right thing? Would you have done the same? I read every comment, and if you want more stories like this, raw, messy, and true, hit that bell. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.